Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Hoplite channel. Today is May 29th, 2023, and we are celebrating the memories of those we lost in combat, those we lost in war, who never got to see home again. This is our Memorial Day, and I want to thank you for tuning in for this brief episode I'm going to do. And I chose to make this episode particularly in dedication to my late grandfather. My late grandfather was born in 1923, and I just realized as I was going through his obituary that he would have turned 100 years old this year. In fact, he would have turned 100 years old 9 days ago. So yeah, it's amazing to think that just in 3 generations, you have 100 years right there. But sadly, he passed away in 2011. But for a guy who grew up in the Great Depression, survived World War II, and made it to 88, he did okay. For his generation, living past 85 as a guy. Yeah, you're beating the odds. But I wanted to talk a little bit about my grandfather and his contribution to this country in service, and tell a little bit of his story, and hopefully you get something out of it. And I'll try to tie it all in at the end. But in any event, let me read his obituary that my mother prepared, and I'll talk a little bit about him after. So we'll call him Jerry because that was the name he went by. Jerry was born May 20th, 1923, and he died December 6, 2011. Jerry was born in Cleveland, Ohio, and raised in Euclid, Ohio. He was a writer, radio and TV director, and producer. He graduated from Cathedral Latin High School in 1940 and was the editor of the school newspaper and yearbook and class valedictorian. His college journalism scholarship to John Carroll University was interrupted when he enlisted in the Army in 1943. In World War II, Jerry was a machine gunner. He won a Bronze Star in Europe and served as press chief for the 103rd Infantry Division, and with his friend Ralph Mueller, co-wrote a division history report after action. The book chronicled the individual acts of heroism of the 103rd soldiers and their liberation of Saint-Dié, France, and death camps in Landsberg, Germany. The reason the book is so good, wrote a Chicago Tribune writer, is because it was written by a corporal and a private, by exhausted guys who couldn't see why the hell they had to go over that mountain, but did so nevertheless with Germans rolling grenades down at them. Post-war, while shuttling between Cleveland and Chicago, Jerry settled in Cleveland, and he finished his college education at Baldwin Wallace. He worked for Beaumont and Holman Advertising Agency in Chicago and won Advertising Age's first award for Best TV Commercial, a commercial for Greyhound Lines, which included the famous tagline, "Leave the driving to us." Jerry represented Fashion Modeling Agency in the arcade and married one of the agency's models, Patricia, in 1951. Together they had 3 sons and a daughter. He wrote for the Cleveland News and several other advertising agencies, then went out on his own, launching Editorial Features Incorporated. His films, radio shows, and documentaries promoted Ohio all over the world. Okay. So yeah, that's a brief snapshot of my grandfather's life. And obviously there's a lot more that happened there in the details, but I could tell you, as a young man growing up, my grandfather taught me a lot of things. Unfortunately, I was kind of too young and impatient to absorb the most important lessons. He taught me how to play chess, which I still enjoy to this day. And he was a very intelligent guy. But I never once saw something in him that led me to believe like he regretted anything about his life. He didn't regret his experience in the war. He didn't, bear any internal scars, although I'm sure he carried a few. But he didn't, carry himself like a bitter old broken man who survived a war and just had a grudge against everybody else, like unfortunately some people experience after war. It didn't break him. And his generation was fortunate because at this time in America, World War II was seen as a very noble endeavor. And I don't want to get into the politics or the history of the war, because Memorial Day is all about remembering those who gave their lives in service of this country, regardless of their political affiliation or any other identifiers. Their identifier is they fought for their country, they died, and they didn't make it back. And that's the whole point. We reserve this day for them. We have Veterans Day, which includes them, but that includes everybody, those who made it home and those who didn't. This is just for those who didn't. And just from that obituary, my grandfather got to live a life. He got to finish his college education. He got to, marry the love of his life, and he had, he got 4 kids out of the deal too, which seems crazy by today's standards. But and one of those kids, obviously, was my mother. So the reason I wanted to dedicate this episode to my grandfather is because, again, he would have turned 100 this year, but he enlisted in the Army, and in 1943. He was barely 20 years old. And I can remember, being a 20-year-old kid, like I didn't know my ass from a hole in the ground. Imagine being shipped over to Europe to fight in a war, and you had just been trained how to fire a gun a couple months prior, if maybe weeks prior. It must have been completely terrifying. And I know he did get a Purple Heart as well. And I want to say when he was a machine gunner, he caught some shrapnel during an engagement. And it was then that I think his commanding officer, a captain, was asking around his platoon, who knows how to write? And my grandfather, because he was an intelligent guy, raised his hand and said, well, I was the editor for the school yearbook, and I was class valedictorian. Like, I can put a sentence or two together. And they said, all right, Jerry, put the gun down. You're going to be our correspondent. You're going to send messages to and from headquarters to the forward operating bases, and that's going to be your gig. And I think after catching shrapnel during that engagement as a machine gunner, he was more than happy to put down the Ma Deuce and to pick up the typewriter. But the real reason for this episode is because I know for a fact my grandfather went to war and met and befriended young men who were his age or perhaps even younger. And when he came home, those guys didn't all come back with him. And I'm talking guys who were probably, barely old enough to drive, that probably lied about their age, which you could easily do back then to enlist. You maybe had kids who were 17, 18 years old, if they were that. And they got shot, they got blown up, and they didn't come back. And my grandfather was one of the lucky ones who did. And I'm certain that he made good friends over there and had to live the rest of his life. And like I said, he died in 2011 at the age of 88. So he got to live many more decades beyond World War II, knowing that there were guys who went over there as kids, as he was, and their lives were cut short, and they didn't get those decades like he got. So I wanted to make this video on Memorial Day for him because he was my grandfather and I knew him personally, but I also wanted to make it for the men he fought alongside who didn't make it home, and for those families who had to go on with that gap in their family tree, and how sad and tragic all that must have been. And I wanted to thank those families for their sacrifice and for, possibly giving my grandfather friends who got him out of that war in one piece. It's one of those debts you can never really substantiate, and you can never ever repay if you could. So that's what I wanted to do on this day, Memorial Day. For those of you who had sons, fathers, husbands, uncles, cousins, brothers and nephews who fought in foreign wars and didn't come home, my deepest condolences for that loss. Their lives were not in vain. We still live, in my opinion, for the time being, the best place on earth because of people like that. So hold your heads high and know that your family definitely gave blood, literally, for the lifestyle, the freedom, and the opportunities we enjoy today. So that's all I wanted to say for this Memorial Day. Thanks for hanging out and tuning in. It's not just another 3-day weekend. This one means a whole lot, especially if you're an American. But we will continue with our regularly scheduled programming for the next episode. I'm going to finish The Great Narrative by Klaus Schwab, and we'll put a bow on that series. Until that time, I want y'all to take care. I hope you had a restful weekend, and we'll see you next time.